Good morning, everyone. My name is Jackie Madison. I'm the president of the North Country Underground Railroad Historical Association. We oversee this beautiful building, the North Star Underground Railroad Museum, and we tell the stories of the Underground Railroads, and I put an S on railroads, in the Lake Champlain area. That's the story of formerly enslaved people that came through this region, as well as Chinese Americans who came into the U.S. due to the Chinese Immigration Exclusion Act, as well as immigrants leaving today. So it's a repeat story. This museum opened in 2011, so we've been here a decade. And it was founded by Don and Vivian Paxson after they were asked, when they participated in the Battle of Plattsburgh, if African Americans was in the War of 1812. That answer is yes. We have stories. We have an object theater in the building that really tells the story of a gentleman who not only escaped from Maryland, but stayed in the region. He stayed in Franklin County and became quite the citizen in that community. We are open from May, Memorial Weekend, through what is now called Indigenous Day, formerly Columbus Day, in October. We open typically 11 to 4 on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Now, we used to be open 7 days a week, but the pandemic changed that. Hopefully, we will get back to more days being open. I would ask if there's anyone here today that's interested in being a docent, see me. And I should point out Andrea. Raise your hand. She's a board member. You can see her as well. I want to talk a little bit before we head out, on what you will actually see today. In our region, you will visit the Evergreen Cemetery, where you will meet Mariah Hayes, who was formerly an enslaved but then became free, and she lived in Keeseville. You will also meet Marjorie Lansing Porter, who was a newspaper editor and who actually wrote extensively about the Underground Railroad, not only in the Lake Champlain area, but west of our region as well. And finally, you will meet probably one of the most anti-slavery individuals of all, Wendell Lansing. He was so vocal that he was actually ran out of Keeseville for about 6 years. But he does come back. He was also the publisher of a newspaper here, and they really remembered what he had done as a newspaper editor, as opposed to what he did as an anti-slavery activist, and they loved him. Then you will go to the Quaker Union, where you will meet Samuel Keese. He was a Quaker, and he was also an abolitionist, and his family were involved in the abolitionist movement. You will see the cemetery there. You'll have a chance to walk through it. And when we leave the Quaker Union, you will head up to the Stephen P. Smith former farm. There is a documented hiding place in that, on that farm. It's actually in a barn, and you will hear from a descendant of Stephen P. Smith, who will be Stephen P. Smith at the farm, as well as Catherine Keese, who was his aunt. Catherine Keese was a lady ahead of her time. She was a teacher, but one of the first things she did, she actually preached in the Dannemora prison. And so I say that's definitely a lady ahead of her time in the mid-19th century. But she traveled extensively. She was from Philadelphia, and she was actually Samuel's second wife. So, that being said, I won't go into more details. I want you to hear what they have to say. You will have a chance to actually look into the room, walk into the room, and take pictures. And you'll probably feel like you're in that time period because there's still some weeds growing in the barn, but they're not tall. You'll be able to get to it. Okay. Then I want to talk a little bit about the details of what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to try to be the lead. We're the black entity down by the mailbox. My daughter, who has better directions at following things than I do, will be the driver, so don't feel bad. If you see me behind the wheel, you have a problem. But I want to talk about lunch. We have actually hoped to have the Arsenal in Elizabethtown provide lunch. That fell through. What I would suggest is that there are some places that you can stop at when you leave the C.B. Smith farm. You can actually stop at the McDonald's. Think of this as a fast food day if you don't mind. Or there's also Dunkin' Donuts. It has a little bit healthier foods. But we also have, as you're coming onto the main street, across from Union Road, is a Grand Union grocery store. And you can stop there to pick up something that's healthier, a salad, something to that effect. There are grocery stores in Elizabethtown, and there's also a Stewart's. And if you can hold off, you might be able to actually eat at the in Lake Placid. So I would say that's another suggestion. They also have a McDonald's, and they have some smaller restaurants that you may be able to go in and get healthier salads. There are restrooms in Elizabethtown, so you'll be able to go there, but if you need to stop, stop. I have provided some written directions, but if you have a GPS system, I would encourage you to use it, if possible. Are there any questions for me, or anything that anyone wants to ask me?
If you get lost, is there a phone number we can call?
Yes, you can call me. My daughter's with me. She has good directions. She's been to France, so she knows how to get around there. So if she knows how to get around there, she can definitely get around here. Well, everyone, you're probably wondering, who is sitting here? We have with us today Mariah Hayes. She will tell you about life in Keeseville. She'll talk about her time as in enslavement, and maybe she'll give you a recipe or so. She's a great cook. So call on her if you need something baked.
Thank you. Can anyone hear me? Yes. Okay.
Try it again.
Can everyone hear me? I had a table. I didn't bring it.
Oh.
Hear that. Hear that. Quiet. No shoes scraping or feet shuffling past my house on Beach Street. No wagons breaking. No "Whoa, Nellie." Not even a dog barking, a cock crowing, or bird song in morn's first light, soft as my lemon meringue. It's the stillness before the world wakes up that soothes me, before the day comes at you like a swarm of bees and you cannot hear yourself think, hear yourself breathe. It's the time I savor freedom. I can do anything, be anything, go anywhere. Freedom, freedom. There was a time when I stood on the other side of freedom. Jamaica, Queens, where I was born, 1794, enslaved to Judge Millington Smith. He born 50 years before my first breath. Old Master was a merchant, lawyer, New York delegate to the Continental Congress. The judge was a big man in New York, this nation. He was the most important anti-federalist bearer's spokesperson. When you serving folks their food, you pick up things, fancy words, and learn how the world works behind the scenes, over supper, billiards, and high tea. Old Master had a central role ratifying the U.S. Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. There are 7 articles. You can look them up yourselves. I don't have time to tell you. But if you want to keep what Old Master helped put in place, vote. Only votes talk. Everything else walks. I can't tell my story without talking about those who I breathe air with, so you can understand where they came from and how I came to be among them. Master was a delegate for the New York Provincial Congress, 22nd May, 1775. He served in the Continental Line Regiment, which he organized as the Dutchess County Rangers. You standing in Clinton County now, but it was once called Albany County, then Charlotte County, then Washington County. Many of the settlers came from downstate, Dutchess County, and Long Island. Old Master descends from Bernard Smith and Margaret Rowe, who begat a son, William, who first married Marie Fevers on 11th August 1625 in Colton, Devon, England. William migrated to New England during the Puritan Great Migration, and that's why I'm talking to you now, because he came to America. William was a big shot deputy, served on Colony Rate Committee, Committee on Wages, Commissioner to End Small Causes, Livestock Appraisal Committee, and Weymouth Magistrate. When his family moved to Rehoboth in 1647, he became a constable, then a surveyor of highways. In 1658, he was a magistrate in Huntington. By 1663, William and Nehemiah, his sons with his second wife, Madeline Crane Olmsted, were granted house lots in Jamaica, Queens. William the immigrant had 2 families, and my Old Master descends from his and Marie's son, Thomas Smith, who married Judith Smith, the parents of Samuel Smith, who married Hannah Denton, who begat Samuel Smith Jr., who married Elizabeth Keziah Waters, and begat 7 kids, including Millington Smith, my Old Master. My Old Master first married Sarah Smith, who died in 1770. A year later, he married Margaret Mott, and their children were Sidney, Richbell Mott, Millington II, and Phoebe Mott. If you've been to Plattsburgh, there's a Margaret Street, and that's named for my Old Master's wife. Colonel Millington was first married to Cornelia Herring Jones, daughter of Dr. Gardner Jones, a prominent Welsh physician. She died in 1810, leaving 2 children, Mary C. Lindsay and Rear Admiral Millington Smith, who fought in the Seminole Wars and War of Secession. But I am getting ahead of myself. When Mistress Cornelia died, There were 28 slaves in Clinton County, including me. On the 4th of May, 1816, Colonel Melanchthon married Anne Green, the daughter of Plattsburgh tavern innkeeper Israel Green, and his wife, Sarah, who were Quakers. Remember this. This is important. Colonel Melanchthon and Mistress Anne had a daughter, Elizabeth Smith Martin. During the Revolution, Old Master was the sheriff of Dutchess County. He took oaths of allegiance from the colonists and arrested and ratted out loyalists and bought up their forfeited land. The Provincial Commission selected him to be the second judge of the Court of Common Pleas. A decade before I was born, Old Master was elected Justice of Peace in Dutchess County, but he moved to New York City to become a prominent merchant. A year later, the judge helped establish the New York Manumission Society with worthies like John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton. I whispered the latter's name. He and my master got into heated debates. Old Master was the most important anti-federalist member of the State Ratification Convention in 1788, and he was one of the ablest debaters in the country, it was said. His vote for the Constitution with the recommendation of amendments broke anti-federalist ranks and brought down Governor George Clinton's wrath. He was one of the few important landowners and merchants among the anti-federalists, and Old Master continued in the Clintonian Party. He was elected to the Assembly in 1791 and canvassed the state for Clinton. In 1792 against John Jay. Not bad for one who was homeschooled by his parents, Samuel and Elizabeth Bale Smith, who were Midland, Long Island farmers. Those in the Manumission Society wanted to stop the rampant kidnapping of free blacks in New York City, who were sold south into slavery. In John Simmons' home, 19 men gathered at the first meeting presided over by Robert Troup in 1785. Old Master, like the rest of them, owned slaves then, but not me because I wasn't born. But he probably owned my mother because she was a slave, I was a slave. Old Master was appointed to draw up the society's rules, and John Jay was elected the first president. Old Master had many irons in the fire. He was one of the 12 original proprietors of the Plattsburgh Old Patent, holding title to 1,120 acres. Plattsburgh was founded the year after my birth. The Platts, Treadwells, Brinkerhoffs, all those families from Dutchess County and Long Island twined their land interests here. They knew each other before they got here. They all fought in the Revolution together, made money together, married each other's kin. Old Melanchthon didn't get to see slavery's end in New York or the United States, as he was the first casualty of the 1798 yellow fever epidemic in New York City. I was transferred to his son, Colonel Melanchthon, and entered his and Mistress Cornelia's household, which increased when their children, Mistress Mary and Master Mel's birth. Then Mistress died shortly after his birth, and the Colonel married dear Anne, who was only 2 years older than me. In 1811, the Colonel, dark with grief, buries himself in work with his business partner, Levi Platt, the son of Plattsburgh founder Zephaniah. They own a forge, sawmill, grist mill, fulling mill, lots, and a lumber yard. On 18th of June, 1812, the Americans declare war against Great Britain. A year later, British Colonel Murray's troops occupied Plattsburgh for 24 hours and torched the blockhouse. Broad Street Arsenal, Army Hospital, Peter Saley's home, and the Daniel Z. Platt storehouse. War clouds rose like the thickest fog over the Battle of Lake Champlain, September 11, 1814. All the American heroes of the battle, I breathed air with them because they went in and out of Colonel's house until he couldn't. He commanded the 29th Infantry Regiment at Fort Monroe, Plattsburgh's biggest garrison, while his brother Sidney served in the Navy under Commodore Thomas McDonough. The British are coming. The British are coming. By September the 3rd, 11,000 British soldiers camped in Champlain. In Plattsburgh, town people fled to the Quaker Union in Peru. Up on Halleck Hill, they watched the Americans fight for their freedom. Not mine, not yet. No way the Colonel, founder and first editor of the Plattsburgh Republican, was going to let me go to the Union. I could be spirited away by Quakers like Samuel Keese, though I was 6 months pregnant with my first child. I scurried between the dwelling of my freeborn husband, Thomas Haynes, a respected barber, and my quarters, the slave quarters in the Colonel's basement, in the finest home in Plattsburgh. The British thought so too. On September the 6th, General George Prevost made my master's home his headquarters, forcing the Colonel to fire hot shot at his own home. A British officer scrounging for food in the pantry got shot. His blood seeped into the wooden floor, and it was always there. It never came out. The carnage was not for the faint of heart, and not for a pregnant woman blooming with my first child, my son, Sir George Prevost, named after the British general. Folks say it was Tom's doing to name our child after the Colonel's enemy, but it was mine. It was like a sliver of glass sticking in my master's craw. My George was born 28th December, 1814, 4 days after the Treaty of Ghent. He favored me, had my complexion, that made some dub me Black Maria. My precious daughter Caroline was born 15th of June, 1816, and she was as fair as my husband Thomas. On June the 22nd, the Colonel files his entitlement to both of my children, Sir George Prevost and Caroline, in the Plattsburgh Minutes book. How can one man own another man's children? I don't understand. After Commodore McDonough's signal victory against the British, Plattsburgh held a big to-do for him on the 23rd of September, 1814. Guess who baked the cake? President Monroe visits Plattsburgh on the 28th of July, 1816, and is escorted to Mistress Anne's father's tavern. The president reviews the troops, inspects the barracks, and visits the Army Hospital. He attends a party at the Colonel's brother's, Captain Smith's home. Guess who baked the cake? The Colonel is recommended as a suitable candidate for the New York Assembly on the 28th of March, 1818. 5 months later, after a long and tedious illness, the Colonel dies on the 28th of March. The Brinkerhoff house is draped in crepe. There's mourning and chaos inside. Mistress Anne frees me and my children. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last. I can now make my own money as a nursemaid, cook, and baker of fine cakes for Plattsburgh's fancy folk. The Colonel's business partner, Levi Platt, takes over the house. Mistress Anne, Missy Elizabeth, and Master Mel moved to her parents' home. In 1821, Master Mel 11 moves to live with Mistress Anne's sister, Deborah Beaumont, and her husband, Dr. William Beaumont, who was acquainted with the Colonel during the War of 1812. That family was torn asunder. Thomas, me, and our children lived between the Folkhay Hotel and the steamboat landing. It is a humble dwelling, but it is ours. I was an original member of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Plattsburgh. Our leader was David Brock, and members included Sheldon Durkee, Ann Durkee, Mary Bacon, Polly Averill, Patience Miller, John Wells, Michael Dermott, John Adams, Felina Brock, Phoebe Edgerton, Ann Smith, and Mr. and Mrs. Joseph I. Green. Until 1831, we met in the courthouse. I sat in the Negro pew, and I walked alone to the table of our Lord, and I was grateful. I was free. I was free. My husband's barbering thrived, and George took up the trade too. Carolyn, a lady's maid, was regularly in my company catering to Plattsburgh's finest ladies. When Carolyn was 15, my baby girl died. From Bridge Street to Riverside Cemetery, townsfolk stood or joined behind George and I as we walked behind her funeral bier with my dead daughter in a coffin. The Colonel's children, Mistress Anne and Mary Katie, joined the procession on Margaret Street near McKee Hotel. Folks knowing I'm a devout Methodist sang hymns to comfort me. They sang, "Why should we mourn departed friends or shake at death's alarms?" In 1835, Mistress Anne moves to Green Bay, Wisconsin. 4 years later, I removed my membership to the Keeseville Methodist Church. I leave behind old friends, Mercy Thomas, Caroline Crabtree, and Harmon Thomas. The other Black faces I knew in town were Diana Robinson and her boys, the eldest one, Lafayette Mason, who fought in the Adirondack Regiment during the Civil War. Others came to town to do their dealing, like the William Tankard and George Tankard and their children who lived in Beekmantown. Martin Tankard was the most famous melt master at the Crown Glass Works in Redford. Here in Keeseville, I met new acquaintances like Mr. Wendell Lansing, Peter Keese, Oliver Keese, kin to those Keese surveyors Zephaniah Platt hired, who established the Quaker Union. Thomas A. Thomason Esquire lives above me on Kent Street, and Oliver Keese is up there all the time. I'm not the only Black folk here. There's Ben and Tamer Lewis. He's a whitewasher, and she is a cook. But she doesn't have my touch for the cakes. Jude Phillips and his brood of 7 live here, as well as Tom and Lucy Brooks and their children, Margaret and Harry. Boat cook Charles James and his wife Martha and their 6 children reside here. John Moore, a steamboat cook, and his wife Mary have 4 daughters, Charlotte, Anna, Maria, and Hannah. Edward Weeks, one of those Garrett Smith land grantees, lives here too. His baby girl is buried right over there, across the road, in the old cemetery. There's a lot that goes on in these parts that I am not at liberty to speak about. There's a lot that floats on the Sable River besides driftwood. Black Maria keeps watch. I lived to see General Robert E. Lee surrender at Appomattox. I lived long enough to see all Black people, even in Texas, be free. I never knew my birthday, but today, June 19th, is as good as any, don't you think?
Yeah.
Well, good day to you kind folks, and may the good Lord bless and keep you.
I changed my name to Marjorie, and I've been described as a historian, an editor, and a folklore and folk music researcher. Oops, excuse this caterpillar. I'll just okay. And I'm a prolific. Was a prolific chronicler of Adirondack life and lore. I love talking to people, and I made history my life's work. I'm buried beside my daughter and my sister. While I was simply a recorder of history, it seems I made history. By recording it, I recorded 69 hours of history and music from the past, and ended up with 245 tapes broken into 449 segments. So that's about 449 separate interviews. And yes, the machine I carried around was heavy and cumbersome, but the reward was great. A year before my death, the New York State Historical Association gave me an award of merit, but that's not what I'm most proud of. I am most proud of the fact that that these tapes are at special collections at the old normal school where I started my education before I was married, and then continued it after I was divorced. My family was in the newspaper business and very involved in sharing community news. We owned the Plattsburgh Sentinel and the Essex County Republican. My grandfather, Abram, was Wendell Lansing's son, and they must have been close as they went into the Civil War together and came out. On their return, they continued the newspaper business. When Abram died, my father, Charles Wendell Lansing, took over. His mother, my grandmother, Hannah Straight Lansing, was a suffragist, an author in her own right, and wrote many articles for her husband's papers without a byline. In the Plattsburgh directories of the time, her employment is listed as editor. I came from a family which recorded everything. Wendell Lansing was and you will hear more about him later, was my great-grandfather, and no one knows about my great-grandmother, Eliza Harrington. Not even her history-focused granddaughter, Ida, knew anything about this woman, and this is a mystery yet to be solved. After divorcing two husbands, and after my children were gone, I began my focus on history. I was Clinton County historian, the city of Plattsburgh historian, and the Essex County historian. I was the first director of the Adirondack History Center Museum, which is sponsoring the event in Elizabethtown that you'll be at later. Interesting too, politics caused me to leave Clinton County, as politics caused my great-grandfather to leave Keeseville for Wilmington. As you'll hear a little bit later, Wendell Lansing was a Keeseville resident, but removed to Wilmington in 1848 when Polk was president. The family story is that it was apparently not healthy to be a Whig, especially a Whig editor in Keeseville. so he thought he would retire temporarily. He ran a forge on the Ausable River in Wilmington, bought a farm there, and was an abolitionist, and much in favor of freeing the slaves. Abolitionists were called nigger lovers to try to make it a bad thing, but it was honorable to be an abolitionist, as we know, and honorable to try to flee from slavery. Wendell's daughter and my great aunt Emma Lansing told me when she was a little girl and lived in Wilmington, she remembered at night there would be Negroes, and then there were none in the morning. She later found out that her father hid slaves in coal carts and moved them on that way. Abram Kilburn was a local person I interviewed. He did not know about my great-grandfather's forge, but he did know there were Negroes living in the area. He thought there was a family named Craig. Mr. Kilburn said they couldn't stand the cold and sold out to the Germans, and the tone of his voice was another immigrant family, group of families coming into the area. But he referred to old John Brown, and he felt had very much respect for him. And he mentioned that he got the Freemans settled in. Well, Freeman was a name that was assigned to free black families. There was one such family in Ingersoll near Shazy, and he was called Charles York, or also Charles Freeman, as he was a free black man. But back to Mr. Kilburn, he had heard about John Brown and thought he was the best around. He credits John Brown with helping fugitives in our area, and he went on to say that they knew the son of a trade slaver in the area who cursed that old John Brown, but they knew others from the South who did not curse him. I was able to tape H.W. Hicks and his presentation on John Brown to the Lake Placid Club in 1954. He reminded us that the wilderness of the Adirondacks was a popular underground railroad route because it would be harder to follow the fugitives through the mountains. Fugitives could hide in caves and barns during the day and travel by night. Mr. Hicks remarked that they might make 20 miles in a day, so required a great many safety stations like John Brown offered. And you will see when you come to the Stevens E. Smith farm later on this morning. Hicks spoke about Garrett Smith, who lived in central New York, whose father had bought thousands of acres at 2 cents an acre. That's what I was told. And Garrett inherited this acreage. Smith and John Brown agreed that Freeman's home between Lake Placid and Keene would be a good center point for fugitives to settle and farm. It turns out it was too cold for most families. And you'll see the rest of this story at the John Brown farm later today. The names of Hazard, Dixon, and Epps were some of the names of black families that remained. We need to continue to document the past. I've met so many wonderful people on my projects and even had the interest of Pete Seeger in my music research. I also made sure there was a marker in front of the Ashel Arthur House, which sits next to the Congregational Church in Keeseville. Ashel's mother, Theodosia Arthur, was a founding member of the Congregational Church, and Ashel signed a petition calling for the formation of the Clinton County Anti-Slavery Society in 1837. I based my request for the marker on oral history, as there were what appeared to be connecting rooms in the lower level of the house where people could have been hidden. I did not have anything other than oral histories of this, no diary, no journal. Oral history said the owners were friends of John Brown. Others reported a tunnel under the river to the house, but that was not proven either. I was able to get a recognition that it was a safe house, a stop on the Underground Railroad, and left it at that. It's a stop on the tours these days where the story of my struggle to get the marker is shared. There are Arthurs buried in this cemetery here. They're a longtime Keeseville family. In reflecting back, I was surrounded by music and history growing up and by the need to record it. I challenge you to record your own history. Talk to the old folks. Document what you can. And good luck with that. And maybe you too will be known for saving local history for future generations to learn and appreciate. Thank you.
The subject of my presentation is myself. And the events that I experienced in my life, some of them, I can't possibly tell you everything. And the topic that I've chosen are the three words that are on my tombstone. Fearless, faithful, and true. It's very good to be here this morning with Mrs. Hayes and with my great-granddaughter.
Yeah, it's on.
Oh, it's very good to be here this morning with Mrs. Hayes and with my great-granddaughter Marjorie. Marjorie and I have Dutch ancestors who settled in Albany, New York. My grandfather Garrett removed to Easton, Washington County, where he owned 3 people. But it was in Washington County where I, Wendell Lansing, became a radical abolitionist newspaper publisher. You see, my father, Abraham Wendell, and my grandfather removed to Madison County, where I was born, attended college, and tried teaching. But I had had enough of classrooms. I took my restless spirit to Washington County and became an apprentice in a printing shop, where I found myself writing, setting type, getting printer's ink on my apron, operating the press, I learned the newspaper business in 8 months. And in 8 months, I was proprietor of the Banner. I also edited the Anti-Masonic Champion, in which we promoted our conviction that Masons murdered William Morgan for threatening to publish Freemasonry's elitist secrets. I, Erastus C. Culver, and Henry B. Northup, yes, the same Henry B. who would rescue Solomon Northup from 12 years of slavery in Louisiana in 1853. The 3 of us joined the Anti-Masonic Party's Republican Young Men of the County of Washington, which declared in 1832 that Freemasonry was the most alarming political evil in our country. Then the Masons merged with the Whigs, and I joined the temperance movement as well. I'll never forget my initiation into the anti-slavery movement. In November of 1834, I helped form the Washington County Anti-Slavery Society, despite the misguided efforts of the thugs who fastened the doors and nailed down the windows of the church in Argyle. The Dutch Reformed Church, in an ignorant attempt to stop us. Those stupid ruffians suspended an effigy of a Negro at the entrance and adorned it with a slip of paper on which they scribbled 4 lines of sublime poetry before signing it Judge Lynch. We removed the nails, entered through a window, unbarred the doors, and let every last delegate in. Then we came together and prayed for the oppressed sons of Africa and formed our committees. By then, it was time for dinner. While some of us went to the public house, a mob of 20 or 30 rum devotees re-entered the church and thrust out the few delegates who had stayed to guard it. The damned drunks barred the door again, braced it with iron bars and rails, and refastened the windows. Some stayed inside and commenced shouting like wild savages, and others put up a guard outside. When our convention president, Colonel John Strait, demanded admittance, one of the mob cursed him and threatened to put a fist in his face. We peaceably retired to the public house, where in my capacity as a member of the executive committee, I reported a number of pungent resolutions. The drunken mob followed us, and two of them burst in upon us. The landlord asked them to leave, but they refused. So he seized the biggest scoundrel's shoulder, lifted him up, and tossed him into the street. When the sot got up and made for the landlord's house, he was grabbed and bound with a rope. The rest of the mob dared not come to his rescue. Next came a well-dressed gentleman with a fine horse who drove to and fro in a wagon, to the back end of which he had attached an image of a large Negro with extended arms. Frustrated that our convention continued unabated, he backed the wagon up to the public house window, where he remained until we adjourned, all the while the mob shouting in triumph. Those rum-blinded fools. We had succeeded in forming the state's first county-wide anti-slavery society, and many such societies would soon follow. Noadiah Moore of Champlain presided over the immediate abolitionists in 1837 when a mob attacked them in Plattsburgh, and they convened in Beekmantown to form the Clinton County Society. In 1838, Samuel Keese of Peru was on their executive committee when they met in the Keeseville Baptist Church. In 1839, Federalists persuaded me to move up here and publish a Whig newspaper. My veteran printer, Ben Patterson, and I packed up everything and enough paper for the first few issues. We landed at Port Kent on Dan Lyon's Whitehall and launched the Essex County Republican on a hand press in September. Our competition was the Keeseville Herald, whose peevish publisher, Anson H. Allen, compared me unfavorably to Mr. Emmons, whose Keeseville Argus had preceded my Fresh Republican. Allen first claimed no objection that Emmons and I were both abolitionist anti-Masons from Washington County, then charged that while Emmons was a Whig, I pretended to be one. I had attended the Botskill Baptist Church in Washington County, where I wed my beloved first wife, Eliza, in 1833. A decade later, I was a member of the very small majority of members who consented to Frederick Douglass speaking in the Keeseville Baptist Church. In Vermont, ignorant Middlebury College students cast him as an escaped convict, stomped their feet, and plummeted him with gravel and eggs. His reception here was respectable. My home was a headquarters for colored men and abolition lecturers. I was running one of the depots of the famous Underground Railroad for escaped slaves fleeing to Canada for freedom. I was forwarding them to Peru Village, to my Quaker friends, Samuel Keese and his nephew, Stephen Keese Smith. We were all keenly interested in what Douglass had to say. His voice was full and rich. Only 2 weeks had passed since the 4th of July, and he lamented, "There is not a foot of land under the stars and stripes of America where I can stand as a free man, stand safe." Samuel Keese rejoiced that our hearts were warmed and spirits stirred by Douglass's sympathetic appeals. The man had been owned by a Methodist and defined the relationship of the master and the slave. The master, he said, has unlimited authority. He decides what the slave shall eat, when and how, when he shall go, where and for how long, when he shall return, when and whom he shall marry, how long he shall remain married. The master decides what is right, wrong, virtue, vice, who the slave shall worship, and when. The master decides everything. after proclaiming to my Baptist brothers and sisters that slavery was a great evil and a flagrant violation of the law of God, I proposed I proposed that we deny the hand of fellowship to enslavers and advocates of slavery and not allow them to receive communion or speak in our pulpit. As Hayes announced he would rather keep company with slave-holding Baptist brethren of the South. You see, he was a trustee and had not been consulted about opening the building to abolitionists. Brother Hayes stopped coming to services and threatened to withdraw his membership, then apologized, blaming his wicked heart on having been harassed by politics. It was an insincere confession, and the hand of fellowship was withdrawn from him. Yet, 6 months later, he was reinstated. When others were similarly censured and reinstated, I washed my hands of the Baptists and their building and went over to the Methodists, but not before I had the noble philanthropist Gerrit Smith speak. Mr. Smith said I was a true friend of the slave. He was pleased that I had joined Clinton County's Liberty Party and distributed their newspaper, Herald of Freedom. Jonathan Tarble at the Plattsburgh Republican published the falsehood that I had no courtesy, gentility, or honor. He called me a pygmy for saying President Tyler was an ass. Oh, for goodness sake. Tyler's top priority was the annexation of Texas. When the Essex County Republican raised its standard for Henry Clay for president in 1844, I found myself in an intolerable moral situation. Clay said he was against slavery, but he kept owning people. Ergo, he was a hypocrite. I was against slavery, but my paper was supporting Clay. Therefore, I was a hypocrite. This dilemma troubled me for 2 years before I sold the Republican to men who kept the Whig banner flying until Clay lost to Loco-Foco Democrat Polk. I moved my family to Wilmington, where I applied my boundless energy to new enterprises, including farming and coal. I transported fugitives from slavery through the mountains in my carts. The coal cart's high size completely concealed passengers on their way to Canada from everyone except my very inquisitive daughter, Emily. When a cart had no one in them the next day, Em would ask, "Papa, where are the people who were in there last night?" I tell her, "Closer to freedom." About 1853, as the dawning rays of the Republican Party began to light the horizon, my old friend, my old anti-slavery friend, I should say, Ashley Arnold of Au came to Wilmington and assured me that the time had arrived for me to end my retirement and re-enter the editorial field. In the spring of 1854, I returned to Keeseville and started the Northern Standard as the organ of the Republican Party of Essex County. I was a member of the Committee of Resolutions on the clear and bright day in 1860 when over 1,000 people, black and white, met in North Elba for a 4th of July celebration to honor our late friend, neighbor, and fellow citizen, John Brown. Gathering at the granite boulder, overshadowing the mound of our immortal saint's grave of 7 months, we warmly welcomed 3 of the 21 who had been with a heroic martyr at Harper's Ferry, John Anderson, Barclay Coppock, and Francis J. Merriam. They were safe with us. The thoughtful, sad, earnest, and powerful Mr. Anderson said it was the first occasion in his life when he felt that he could stand on a 4th of July platform. The day to him had hitherto been a lie. We also welcomed the frail Thaddeus J. Hyatt, who had aided Captain Brown financially and recently been released from the loathsome Washington City prison. The senatorial inquisition called the Harper's Ferry Commission had confined him to for disobeying its subpoena. Richmond, Virginia's Daily Dispatch called us insurrectionists. At our celebration, a grand glorification of unabated madness. We were ridiculed for our black republicanism, but when we elected Abraham Lincoln president 4 months later, we were vindicated and triumphant.
Good morning, everyone. Wait for a few more folks who are coming here. After we're done, we can take a walk into the cemetery to our story here and to the next couple of stops along the tour. The Stephen K. Smith family, which had the barn we're going to visit, are buried here, and is Samuel Keese's wife will hear from his wife Catherine at the next stop as well. So it's maybe worth, if you want to take the time to go in there and see a few of the graves. I'm not sure between the microphone, the text, and the hat which is going to win here, but I think at this point. I think that at this point the microphone is most important. So we stand together here on hallowed ground of the Quaker Union Cemetery, and we naturally think of this as an abolitionist center. More than any other religious community, the Quakers are associated with the anti-war and anti-slavery beliefs and covenants that have been a major part of religious life in the United States forever. They formed a vital part of the Underground Railroad in this region. They were not alone. They worked with many other non-Quakers to help freedom seekers, as you will find on other parts of the tour. A little closer. I'm speaking to you today in the voice, I hope, here in Peru, in the North Country delegate to the 1835 founding convention of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. Drawings of Samuel Keese suggest he had much more hair than I do. The founding convention of that New York Anti-Slavery Society, a meeting that started in Utica in the Mohawk Valley, but ended up 27 miles away in Peterborough after a local mob broke into the church where we were meeting and threatened our safety. The local congressman was part of that mob. I also speak to you as a descendant of slave-owning Quakers. Yes, we Quakers had our dissenters, and not all meetings and families adopted the anti-slavery credo at the same time. In fact, one of the first Keese family members to migrate here from the Hudson Valley had been expelled from his meeting for refusing to free a young man that he had as an enslaved boy. Here in Peru, however, our extended family became and remained early and strong abolitionist leaders and carried that commitment for more than a generation. As early as 1833, my first wife Hannah and I both circulated petitions against the continuing existence of slavery in our nation's capital. Some 600 women signed those petitions, and Hannah was president pro tem of the Peru Female Anti-Slavery Society, holding its meetings in the Friends Meeting House that stood on the road right behind you in 1838. Orthodox meeting house of the Quaker community, and it was on this side of the road at one point, later moved across there, time somewhat. In those days, when we were circulating petitions about slavery in the nation's capital, Abraham Lincoln was an aspiring young politician who declared himself to be against slavery, but also against abolitionism. 1838 is the same year that a 20-year-old we know as Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery in Maryland. Harriet Tubman was barely a teenager when we began that D.C. petition campaign. Slavery was abolished finally in New York State, of course, in 1827. You can see that our activities on the slavery question were very early. Other activities around the country, other people's sense of religion. We too were denied meeting space by angry local citizens, just like the Utica folks. Some of those neighbors here were pro-slavery. Some of them feared that our agitation was bound to fracture the nation, and therefore we should insist. Churches were intimidated into banning abolitionist-leaning speakers. You will learn more about the specific activity of the Underground Railroad from my nephew, Stephen K. Smith, at your next stop on a tour today. Suffice it to say that here on my land, which is now part of Northern Orchards, we kept a team of fast horses capable of leading the fleeing families north to freedom in Canada. The Underground Railroad was a network of people and families committed to helping desperate people escape to freedom, illegally. In some parts of the country, it was more secret than in others. Here in Peru, in our Quaker community, there was not much danger of being turned over to the sheriff for illegally helping runaways. Although there were pro-slavery people and even slaveholders living very near to us in the Quaker Union at the same time. But they didn't turn us in, or if they did, the sheriff didn't pay attention. No one knows how many people were working on the railroad, and nobody knows how many people really rode that line to freedom. Some people later call it the first real civil rights movement in the United States. A democratic one in the sense that it rose up from the people rather than from political leadership. There's an estimate that perhaps 100,000 people, enslaved people, were helped to escape over the decades from 1800 to 1860. Probably fewer than 20,000 people were active participants in that activity as leaders or activists on the Underground Railroad. Now, considering that there were 4 million people approximately enslaved in this country at the beginning of the Civil War, the fact that perhaps 100,000 people were helped to escape over the Underground Railroad is just a tiny number, a tiny percentage of the people who were enslaved. But we Underground Railroad people, activists, felt a moral obligation. We couldn't change the law, but we could, and we did, help individuals and families escape. I was widowed in 1846 when Hannah died. I remarried Catherine Robinson, who was both a teacher and a Quaker minister, raised in Philadelphia. She became one of the true abolitionist leaders in our area, harboring fugitives and refusing to use products like sugar and cotton that were produced by enslaved labor, as well as leading our meetings and anti-slavery discussions. Catherine also found time to minister to inmates at the new state prison in Dannemora. As you can see from her headstone nearby, she died on the cusp of the beginning of the Civil War. The Civil War itself, a horrific and cataclysmic chapter in our history. As a committed opponent of slavery, I, Samuel Keese, was, of course, in favor of doing everything possible we could to end that terrible institution, the original sin of our nation's history. But as a committed anti-war Quaker, I could not personally endorse going to war. This was a struggle for many people in my faith. Back in 1835, in fact, I attended the Society of Friends national meeting in New York City and urged that organization to avoid war by embracing the nonviolent political campaign for immediate emancipation nationally. Obviously, that effort was a failure. Not only did Congress refuse to outlaw slavery, in fact, the next year, in 1836, Congress adopted a gag rule prohibiting any debate about slavery. From the Constitution itself, to the Missouri Compromise in 1820, to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and then the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the government could not confront the question of slavery. War was the result. Catherine did not live to see the realization of our dreams, the elimination of this great evil. I wrote many words in devotion to her spirit and her record, a memoir, several poems. I'd like to leave you with part of my farewell poem to her. Bondsman Claim lay on her heart. She recognized his woes and of his suffering bore her heart. And all his wrongs exposed. She loved to aid him in his flight from bondage long and sore, and gladly would his pathway light to freedom's happy shore. In unpaid toll she would not share, for pleasure or for gain, but turned away from dainties rare that held the slave in chains. Thank you, and I'd be happy to.
Greetings, friends. I thank thee for coming to visit me on this fine summer day in June of 1856. This barn behind me is a station on the Underground Railroad, and I am what is called a station agent and conductor, as on actual railroads. Here I harbor runaway slaves in daytime, and under cover of darkness, I drive them hidden beneath a load of hay to the Canadian border and freedom. I will tell thee more about that, but first I see my Aunt Catherine Keese approaching. She is the wife of Samuel Keese, who you met at the cemetery a short time ago. Even though she is my aunt, we were both born the same year, 1806, 50 years ago. Catherine, how is thee today?
Tired, nephew, most tired, but satisfied to have been doing the Lord's work.
Has thee been to the prison recently?
Yes, just yesterday.
And on that cold, rainy day, surely you have the strength of your convictions. Friends, we Quakers believe there is that of God in each person, no matter how hidden it may be. We therefore believe in equal treatment of all, no matter their circumstances. Accordingly, we have been active in prison ministry and reform, along with abolition of slavery and other causes, from our very beginnings in England 200 years ago in the mid-1600s. This grows partly from our own experiences of being in prison in England for what were considered our radical and dangerous beliefs. Catherine, he sees we have visitors today. Will he tell them about thy prison ministry?
Yes, but first I should tell them a bit about myself. I was born Catherine Robinson in New York City 50 years ago. My father was a Quaker merchant, and my mother was a teacher in a Quaker school. From a young age, I felt called to teach. For education's always been very important to Quakers.
Tell our visitors how he came to live here in the Quaker Union.
Oh yes, well a few years ago, Samuel Keese came to the city to attend a Quaker gathering. He told me he lived in the Quaker Union way up north in a settlement close to the border with Canada and near the village of Peru in the Lake Champlain Valley. He said his wife had died 2 years before. We talked at length, and I learned he was a farmer, an abolitionist, and a champion of women's suffrage, another cause dear to Quakers because we have always believed in the equality of women, and he was a kind man. Shortly after, according to the custom of the Quakers, we petitioned our meetings, our word for churches, to appoint a joint committee to oversee our marriage. In 1847, 9 years since by now, I moved with my husband to the Quaker Union.
How did he become involved in the prison ministry?
Well, when I first came to the Union, I continued as a teacher, but not far away was the state prison in Dannemora, and I was led to request permission to minister to the inmates there. It was hard, especially because a woman had never before been permitted to offer spiritual guidance to the prisoners, who were all men, but finally I was allowed to enter.
How did he get there, and was he frightened?
Oh, Samuel took me in his wagon, and he waited for me. It was 15 miles up into those mountains, and the roads were very rough, so it was a difficult and uncomfortable journey. But I sustained myself knowing that God rode with me and wanted me to bring comfort to the prisoners, and that no matter the hardship of the trip, it was better than being locked up. Whenever I was afraid, I turned to God for support, and I did that often. Most of the guards did not want any women in the prison, especially one from a fringe denomination with beliefs they distrusted. Many of the prisoners had committed murder, with no hope of ever returning to their lives in the outside world. I soon realized that the prisoners, and the guards too, were afraid and discouraged. I tried to deliver hope and faith. I spoke of good things and read from the Bible to them, and I believe I helped some of them. I think even some of the guards came to accept me after a time. Now, nephew, I wonder if you would tell these kind visitors about their work with the Underground Railroad. Does it continue to go well? And why does he do it?
Yes, Aunt, it does go well, thanks be to God. Friends, in the decade of the 1850s, Quakers in the South and North became involved in the Underground Railroad. We write to each other often, and that way in language written in code so we would not be discovered. I learned that some sought a station agent in our area, and I was led to offer my services. Why do I do it? I must repeat that we Quakers believe there's a bit of God in each person, regardless of gender, skin color, or anything else. We call this the inner light. Now, friends, think on this. How can they own a piece of God? How can they own light? How can they own a human being? How can they buy and sell these things? These people are vessels for God and his light, and I could not refuse the calling to aid them.
Oh, I have brought food and bandages for thy fugitives. What else does thee do, Stephen?
Thank thee, Catherine. We certainly can use those aids. I sometimes give them clothes. They often lack proper clothing for our cold northern climate.
Especially like yesterday.
Exactly, yes. I do my best to comfort them, especially the children who are so scared they shake. I give them medicine and treat their injuries. Once I was able to cut the ball and chain off of a man's ankle. He said he had dragged it all the way from South Carolina. His cuts and abrasions and bruises were most grievous with infection, and I doctored them the best I could. At night, I helped them into the lower part of my hay wagon that I have outfitted with a false floor, pile hay on that floor to hide them and carry them north. I do unto them as I would have others do unto me. I treat them as people who are the same as thee and me in God's eyes.
It must be dangerous. The Fugitive Slave Act makes it illegal to harbor fugitives and assist runaways.
Yes, Catherine, it does, but there are times when God's law must come before man's. I'm careful. The fugitives are brought to me at night through those woods behind my barn. I built that wall and I secured them behind a false wall. I built that wall so it looks like there is no space behind it. The farmer who lives in that house there across the road is not sympathetic to our cause. He covets the reward money that is offered to those who turn in Underground Railroad conductors and station agents as well as runaways. I know him to have spied on me, but darkness is our protection. Darkness and God's will. And the sheriff stands with us.
Really?
Yeah. He came to me one afternoon last month and told me my neighbor had informed him I may be helping escapees, so he was duty-bound to come back later and investigate. I made sure my guests were well hidden, motionless, and silent that day.
God bless that sheriff. Well, truly, each of us has had to overcome our fears and the opposition of others to act on our convictions, to go where God leads us.
Yes, Catherine, we have. It is not always easy to practice what we preach. It's the strength of the Lord that allows us to overcome by leading us to seek and draw out the good in all men and women. Well, thanks everyone for sharing our Readers Theater presentation today. I'll explain why we did it in this format later privately to anybody who's interested. I'm Neil Burdick. Stephen Keese Smith was my great-great-grandfather, and Catherine Keese, my great-great-great aunt, I think. I don't have a family tree, I have a family jungle, so. There may be another great in there. And portraying Catherine is my wife, Barbara, as I said. We are both practicing Quakers, active in the St. Lawrence Valley Friends meeting in Potsdam, Canton area, about 100 miles west of here. I'm the author of today's script. Our costumes are kindly on loan from the North Star Museum, although Barbara is too modest to say that she made her bonnet and will donate it to the museum after this performance, since we won't be going to Broadway. In our portrayal, we have used mostly current words and grammar so as to be more easily understood, with one authentic exception, the use of thee and thy for you and your. This was known among Quakers as plain language. In a nutshell, in class-conscious England, where Quakerism began in the mid-1600s, thee and thy were to be spoken only to those considered to be in lower social stations, you and your to everyone else. But the Quakers, believing firmly in the equality in many forms of all persons, as we have discussed, used the plain words for all, which greatly offended those who considered themselves superior. This was one reason why many Quakers, including my Keese ancestors, fled England and came to America. This plain language has since passed out of usage. The general outline of the story we have told is based on documented facts, family records, and the like. However, we have fictionalized some details. For example, we don't know for sure how Catherine traveled to the Dannemora prison.
Frankly, I think she would have driven herself.
She may have. And there's no firm evidence for the ball and chain incident. It has come down through orally transmitted stories. Stephen Keese Smith remained a station agent on the Underground Railroad for as long as it existed, helping unknown dozens of escaped slaves make their way to Canada and freedom. Unknown because no records were kept, again, for safety reasons. He was never caught. For the rest of his life, he was a spiritual and secular leader within the Quaker Union, remaining active in several social causes. He and his children continued farming this land until his peaceful death in 1894 at age 88, having led a long, fruitful, and devout life. By the mid-1900s, the farm had passed out of the family's hands.
In the late 1850s, Catherine Keese returned to teaching, holding a school for the children of the Quaker Union in her and Samuel's modest home, while continuing her ministry at the prison. She also traveled among friends, as the Quaker saying puts it, speaking about her ministry to Quaker and non-Quaker audiences as far away as Western New York, Pennsylvania, and parts of Canada. Additionally, she took on leadership roles in both her religious and social communities. This proved to be a very demanding schedule, and when she became ill early in 1860, she lacked the strength to recover. She died peacefully at home on March 27th of that year, a week before her 54th birthday. She and Stephen, along with many other members of the Quaker Union community, lie at rest in the burying ground, which is the preferred Quaker term for cemetery, where you stopped on your way here.
Thanks again for visiting my ancestors' farm today. We will gladly answer any questions you may have about this place or the characters we portrayed or the Quaker faith. We don't have a lot of time, I realized, if you want to keep schedule, but yes, ma'am.
I see a for sale sign here. Is it for sale to the public, or is there any effort in preserving this location?
I don't know that. Jackie, you better speak to that.
Yes, this is actually private property, and we have the rights to actually bring visitors on to see the hidden. You'll get a chance to see. So any private person can purchase property. But we think we will still have access to it. We hope we will.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Did Harriet Tubman work in this area? Was she active in this area?
I don't believe so, but I don't know.
What was the question?
No.
She was in West
To our
Virginia?
knowledge, we have no documentation to prove Harriet Tubman was in this
No.
area. Although John Brown was a good friend of hers, we have nothing to indicate that she came to this area.
She was more in the western part of the state?
More central western, yes.
Yeah.
She's known to have gone to Albany with her passengers and then to the central part of the state.
Okay.
Man knows a lot.
Folks, like all of my Keese ancestors, I've kind of gotten hard of hearing, so if you direct your questions to Barbara, she will translate, and I'll make an attempt to answer them.
Can we see the space where they...
Yes, you want to take them around?
I guess if you're ready to do that, yes. All right, let's go see the place where the slaves are hidden.
But what he didn't know was that the sheriff was a friend of Smith, and he would tell Smith, well, I got to come around and take a look at your place. And that was the cue for him to either take them out of here or to make sure that they were well concealed. Now, behind the house, when you first came in, there used to be a kitchen. Remember, kitchens were separate from the homes because they tended to burn down from the cooks. The kitchen burned down, and it was never replaced.
Has any archaeological work been done on the property? By Plattsburgh?
No. It's always been in private hands.
They went around the barn.
They went around. The barn was
students.
Yes.
Yeah, students went around the barn and they chose certain spots. They also dug the old outhouse out.
Right.
And got pails and pails of wonderful things. I think Frank Field
And
has
actually,
them somewhere.
yeah, and there was an archaeological dig. What you see, you cannot get into the room the way it is now. So that was done. And if you look on the table behind you, those are some of the artifacts that came out of that dig. We have some at the museum, so if you want to come to the museum at some time on Friday, Saturdays, or Sundays, between 11 and 4, you will get to see them. Yes. Well, some people say Sable, some people say Keeseville. I say yes to all of them. Whatever you decide you want it to be at that time. Now, Neil also said that if you look, there was these little hooks here on the sides of the door. He said that it was actually some type of a barrier, or I don't know if it was a thing that was put there, so that if someone came to look, they would think, oh, nothing back there but dirt. So it was used as a mechanism to fool people.